They say some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. But what if I told you that one of the darkest, most shocking secrets of the British royal family was hiding in a place everyone overlooked for decades? Not a palace chamber, not a private vault, but a garage. A seemingly ordinary, innocuous garage tucked away behind Prince Andrew's estate, guarded by nothing more than the illusion of privacy and normalcy. What happened inside this garage isn't just a scandal, isn't just a story of intrigue. It is a chilling, terrifying revelation that shakes the very foundations of what we think we know about power, secrecy, and betrayal. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began with a rumor, a whisper, late-night conversations between staff that they hoped no one else would overhear. You shouldn't go near that place, one would say. It's not safe. You'll regret it. For years, people laughed it off, chalked it up to imagination, or perhaps overactive royal servants trying to make their jobs seem more important than they were. But whispers have a way of persisting, particularly when they are anchored in truth. And truth, in this case, was far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. The garage was, on the surface, just like any other. A metal door, slightly rusted hinges, the faint smell of motor oil and gasoline lingering in the air. The floor bore tire marks and the faint traces of tools left behind by staff or visitors. Yet behind this ordinary facade, something unspeakable lay waiting. Something that, once discovered, would leave witnesses trembling, authorities scrambling, and the public unable to turn away. Do you know the feeling of dread when you open a door and immediately sense that something is wrong? The kind of gut-deep unease that sets your heart racing before your eyes even see the truth? That's exactly what happened the night someone finally crossed the invisible boundary. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone driven by curiosity, a mixture of boldness and recklessness that would forever change the narrative of Prince Andrew's private life. They didn't know it yet, but within those walls, lifeless bodies awaited. Bodies that spoke of secrets, power, and betrayal that stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined. You might be asking yourself, how could a royal figure like Prince Andrew have something so sinister hidden in plain sight? After all, he's a public figure. A prince. A man whose every move, every public appearance, is dissected, analyzed, and photographed. Yet there exists a chasm between public perception and private reality. And in this case, that chasm is vast. Because while the world focused on appearances, gala events, charity fundraisers, interviews, and photo ops, behind the garage door, a chilling tableau remained untouched, a dark secret that only a brave or foolish few would ever confront. It wasn't just the physical discovery that shocked people. It was the implications. Every lifeless body told a story. Every silence spoke louder than words. And every inch of that garage seemed to contain clues about a life of secrecy and influence gone horribly, dangerously wrong. What were these bodies doing there? How long had they been left unseen? And most importantly, why? These questions began to circulate almost immediately, whispers turning into speculation, speculation into rumors, and rumors into a global obsession. Imagine, for a moment, walking into a space that you've thought of as ordinary your entire life, and being confronted with something so horrific, so inconceivable, that your mind refuses to process it. That was the reaction of the first person to step into that garage. They froze. Their breath caught. The world outside continued, oblivious. Cars drove past. Birds chirped in the gardens. And yet inside that garage, time seemed to stop. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of secrets that should have remained buried forever. What makes this story even more compelling is the duality of Prince Andrew's life. The public prince, a man of appearances, parties, and ceremonies. And then the private Andrew, whose life held layers of mystery, privilege, and yes, darkness. People have tried to reconcile these two images for years, struggling to believe that a man so visible could harbor such hidden horrors. And yet, when the garage door creaked open that night, reality proved stranger, more chilling, and more unbelievable than fiction could ever hope to be. There's a reason the world can't look away from stories like this. Humans are wired for curiosity, for suspense, for the thrill of understanding something we weren't supposed to know. And that is exactly why this story resonates. Because it is not just about a garage or a prince. It is about the human capacity for secrecy, for deception, and for the shocking lengths that some will go to protect their private worlds, no matter how horrific. You might be thinking that this is an exaggeration, that perhaps it's a dramatization, a story stretched to the point of disbelief. But the evidence, the testimonies, and the subsequent investigations leave no room for doubt. Something unimaginable happened in that garage. And what happened next sent shockwaves through the royal household, law enforcement, and the media. Authorities scrambled. Investigators whispered among themselves. And whispers began to leak. Hints of something so serious that the world was about to be forever changed. So why does this story matter now? Why are we telling it at this exact moment, rather than leaving it buried in the shadows where it has lingered for so long? Because the truth, like all secrets, eventually finds its way into the light. And now, more than ever, the world is watching. In an era where public figures are scrutinized more than ever, where social media amplifies every rumor into a global headline, and where accountability is demanded at all levels, the events of that garage have become a focal point, a symbol of everything hidden, everything forbidden, and everything that people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect. And yet, despite the horror, the shock, and the whispers of conspiracy, there is something deeply human about this story. The curiosity that drove someone to enter the garage, the fear that gripped them as they uncovered the unimaginable, the moral questions that will haunt investigators, royal staff, and ordinary people alike for years to come. How could something like this happen? Who is responsible? And most importantly, what comes next? As you sit here listening, reading, imagining, you might wonder, what did they actually find? How could a royal garage, of all places, harbor such a dark secret? And how did the first witnesses react when confronted with the lifeless bodies within? The answers are shocking, disturbing, and yet fascinating. They speak to the darkest corners of power and privilege, the kind of secrets that make you question everything you think you know about the people who are supposed to be above reproach. But here's the catch. What happened next was even more unexpected, because the discovery of those bodies did not just lead to fear or investigation. It unleashed a cascade of events, decisions, and revelations that nobody saw coming. Investigators were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The palace scrambled to contain the fallout. And outside, the world waited, on the edge of disbelief, for details that seemed almost too horrific to be real. And now, dear viewer, as you continue to listen, as you continue to follow this story, you must ask yourself, if you were standing there, facing the same scene, what would you do? Could you handle the truth? Could you comprehend the scale of the horror? Could you reconcile the image of a prince, a public figure, with the grim reality hidden in his private garage? The story ahead is one of suspense, shock, and revelations. Each layer we uncover will challenge your assumptions. Each detail will deepen the mystery, and each twist will keep you questioning what you thought you knew. And by the end, you will understand why this garage, this ordinary-looking space, became the epicenter of one of the most chilling royal discoveries in modern history. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that the garage itself had a reputation long before anyone dared to step inside? That it was whispered about in corridors, murmured about in staff quarters, and treated with a fear that most people reserve only for haunted houses or forbidden rooms? You see, this was no ordinary storage space. To those who worked near it, who glimpsed it in passing, the garage had a presence, a weight, almost a personality, that made people pause, reconsider, sometimes even walk the other way. Stories began decades ago. Small things at first. A door mysteriously locked at odd hours, a faint smell of chemicals that lingered in the air, noises that sounded like footsteps when no one was there. Staff would shrug it off. The prince likes his privacy, they would say. But the more it was ignored, the louder the whispers became. Late-night deliveries, vanishing items, and glimpses of unidentifiable objects that nobody could explain. There were rumors about what might be inside, each one darker than the last. One staff member, who had worked for the household for over a decade, once confided to a friend, "It's not what you think. It's worse." And that fear, that tension, it became a kind of legend in itself. Everyone knew someone who had seen or heard something strange, but no one ever stayed long enough to find out the truth. It became a rite of passage among the younger staff, a challenge to sneak close, maybe peek through a crack, and return unharmed. Few succeeded. Some quit. And those who did peek rarely spoke of it again. You might be wondering, what makes a garage so ominous? Aren't they just places to park cars, store tools, maybe keep an old bicycle? On the surface, yes. But this garage, hidden behind the sprawling estate, was different. It wasn't about the cars or the tools. It was about the secrets, the aura of power and protection, the knowledge that the space was both a threshold and a barrier. Everyone who came near it sensed it immediately, even if they couldn't articulate why. And there were hints, subtle, almost invisible, that something wasn't right. The locks were not ordinary. They were reinforced, tamper-proof. The cameras, which at first seemed like standard security, were positioned with a precision that suggested they were watching more than just cars and deliveries. And the guards. Oh, the guards. Not the uniformed, ceremonial type you see at public events. These were men and women trained in discretion, in silence, in preventing anyone from stepping too close. Curiosity, of course, is a human trait, and for someone with boldness or recklessness, or perhaps a dangerous mix of both, that curiosity becomes irresistible. Imagine knowing that behind a simple door lies the unknown, and every instinct screams to look, but every fiber of your being warns you not to. The first person who finally entered the garage faced that precise tension. Heart racing, palms sweaty, a voice in their head screaming both yes and no at the same time. But why did it remain untouched for so long? Why didn't anyone report what they suspected? That's the paradox of fear and privilege. When power is involved, ordinary rules cease to apply. People hesitate. They rationalize. They tell themselves that if someone as untouchable as a prince has a private space, whatever is inside must be acceptable, or at least untouchable. But when you're confronted with the unexpected, with something that violates every moral and rational boundary, that reasoning crumbles instantly. Over the years, the legend of the garage grew. New staff heard about it. Old staff left, but the stories persisted. There were tales of strange smells that seemed to linger no matter how much ventilation was used. Lights flickering on and off for no reason. Doors that appeared locked, then suddenly ajar. Even the most skeptical visitors felt an unsettling weight when passing by, a sense that someone, or something, was always observing. And then there were the unexplained disappearances. Small, almost imperceptible. A cleaning supply goes missing. A box of tools disappears. A package that was delivered one day is gone the next. Nothing overtly criminal, nothing that could be easily proven, but enough to make people uneasy. The whispers grew. Something happens here when no one is looking. Something bad. Something people don't want you to see. You might be asking yourself, could all of this be paranoia? Could it be the imagination of overworked staff? Maybe. But when multiple independent accounts describe the same strange occurrences, the coincidences start to pile up into something undeniably unsettling. People who once laughed at the legend eventually admitted to feelings of dread, to dreams in which the garage appeared in impossible ways, doors opening by themselves, shadows moving where no one should be. And yet, despite all of this, no one dared enter. Until that night. Until curiosity, fear, and opportunity collided in a way that no one could have anticipated. Someone decided to see the truth for themselves. Someone willing to risk reprimand, dismissal, perhaps even legal consequences, to peer behind the locked door. And as they approached, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Every sound of the estate, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of crickets, the faint rustle of leaves, was amplified. Every instinct screamed to turn back. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. What makes this even more remarkable is the contradiction inherent in the space itself. On the outside, it appeared mundane. A simple metal garage door, rust starting to creep along the edges, the faint smell of oil and dust. Ordinary, forgettable. And yet, inside, the legend promised, no, demanded, attention. That contradiction, between ordinary exterior and extraordinary interior, created an almost irresistible tension. It is the kind of tension that draws people in, makes them question their judgment, and pushes them toward decisions they might later regret. And this is the paradox of power and secrecy. The more untouchable someone is, the more their private spaces attract attention. The more ordinary they appear, the more extraordinary the secrets they hide. Prince Andrew's garage, in this way, became not just a place, but a symbol, a threshold between public perception and private reality, between mundane appearances and horrific truths. And so, the legend of the garage persisted, growing with each whispered story, each unexplained disappearance, each shadow seen from the corner of an eye. It was a story that prepared the ground for the discovery that would shock the world. People didn't know the scale of what lay inside. They didn't know how it would challenge their understanding of morality, power, and secrecy. They didn't know that the first glimpse into the garage would reveal not just objects or tools, but lifeless bodies that would change the narrative forever. What drew the first person in? Was it sheer curiosity? Recklessness? The sense that they were about to witness something no one else would ever see? Perhaps all of these things. But the moment their hands touched the cold metal door, the moment it began to creak open, the atmosphere shifted. The world outside continued, oblivious, while inside, history was about to be rewritten. And this is where the legend ends. Or perhaps it is where it begins. For the stories, whispers, and warnings could only do so much. They could hint at danger, suggest horror, but they could not prepare anyone for what lay beyond the threshold. The garage, for all its ordinary appearances, had kept it secret. But secrets, as we all know, have a way of demanding to be revealed. And what came next? Well, that is the moment when legend became reality, and reality became a story that no one could turn away from. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when curiosity collides with forbidden territory? When a person decides to step into a space that has been whispered about for decades, and nothing will ever be the same again. That night began like any other, deceptively quiet, cloaked in the ordinary sounds of a sprawling estate at rest. The wind rustled through the trees. The distant hum of a car engine in the driveway. Crickets chirped in rhythm with the stillness of the night. Nothing suggested that history was about to be rewritten behind a simple, rusted garage door. The person who approached the garage was not a random intruder. They were someone familiar with the estate, someone trusted, or at least tolerated, by those who managed it. They had heard the stories. They had laughed at the warnings. But tonight, a mix of courage, recklessness, and perhaps desperation drove them forward. Step by step, they walked across the gravel, each crunch beneath their shoes echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The air was heavier than usual, carrying a faint metallic scent that made them pause. Something about the garage seemed to thrum with anticipation, almost as if it knew a witness was arriving. Have you ever had that moment, when every instinct in your body screams that something is wrong, and yet you push forward anyway? That's what it felt like. Their hand hovered over the cold, metal handle. They hesitated, wondering if this was the line they should never cross. But then, curiosity won. The handle turned. The door creaked. The sound was loud in the silent night, a shriek of warning or an invitation. It was impossible to tell. Inside, the garage was dimly lit, though not by any standard light. Faint streaks of light from the small windows at the top of the door barely penetrated the shadows. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the intruder's cautious movements. And then, just beyond the reach of their eyes, the first object came into focus, a shadow that did not belong, a stillness that could not be explained. Something moved, or rather, it didn't move at all. It was a body, and suddenly, every rational thought collapsed. Their heart raced. Adrenaline surged. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and every instinct screamed to flee. But flight was impossible. Not yet. Because what lay before them was more than just one body, more than a single tragic tableau. It was a collection of lifeless forms, arranged or left in a way that suggested purpose, secrecy, and horror beyond imagination. The intruder's eyes darted from one figure to another, struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. They stumbled back, gripping a nearby shelf for balance. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger. The dust on the floor seemed almost like ash, settling over the scene as if to mute it, to conceal it, to make it unreal. And yet, it was real. Every detail screamed reality, screamed the terrible truth. These were not mannequins, not props, not illusions. They were people. Who were they? How did they get here? The questions slammed into the intruder with a force that made them gasp. Fear mixed with disbelief. There was no immediate explanation, no rational account that could make sense of what their eyes were witnessing. They felt their knees weaken, their vision blur, and yet they could not look away. Every instinct told them to run. Every rational thought demanded retreat. But the pull of the unknown, of uncovering the secret, kept them rooted in place. And then came the noise. A subtle, almost imperceptible shuffle from the far corner of the garage. They froze. Was it another person? Something moving? Or was it their mind playing tricks in the dim light? Sweat dripped down their forehead, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Their hands shook as they tried to steady themselves. They stepped cautiously toward the noise, each movement deliberate, each breath shallow, knowing that any sudden motion could trigger a catastrophe or expose them to danger they could not yet comprehend. As their eyes adjusted, more details emerged. There were signs of struggle. Scattered objects hinted at attempts to conceal, to obscure, to hide what had been done. There were traces of materials that didn't belong, ropes, bindings, remnants of cloth, items that spoke of containment and control. It was clear that the garage had not simply been a storage space. It had been a place of deliberate, calculated activity, a place where secrecy was paramount, and where every element of the environment had been controlled to hide the unthinkable. Can you imagine standing there, realizing that what you were witnessing was not an accident, not a freak incident, but the result of planning? That every shadow, every object, every stillness had been orchestrated to keep the truth concealed? That is what the intruder felt. Shock gave way to horror. Horror gave way to questions they could not answer. And above it all, a dreadful awareness. They were not the first to witness this. Someone had left these bodies here for a reason. Someone had trusted that they would remain unseen. And then, the faint sound of movement again. Different this time, closer, heavier. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was inside the garage with them. The intruder's pulse hammered in their ears. They ducked behind a shelf, trying to control their breathing, trying to stay invisible. Every instinct screamed to escape, to flee, but their body refused to obey. Curiosity, the same force that had driven them here, kept them rooted to the spot. They noticed something else, signs of life that didn't belong to the lifeless bodies. A flicker of light, a shadow moving unnaturally, a sound of something being shifted. And in that moment, the reality of the situation hit them fully. This was not just about discovery. This was about danger. Someone could walk in at any moment. Someone could see them. And yet, leaving now meant abandoning the most significant, horrifying discovery of their life. The scene was overwhelming. The mind cannot process this many contradictions at once. Life and death intertwined. The mundane garage transformed into a theater of horror, secrecy clashing with revelation. It was almost too much to bear. The intruder's hands shook. Their vision blurred. They tried to focus, tried to understand, but the more they looked, the more they realized that the garage had been a stage for something far more sinister than they could have imagined. And then, something entirely unexpected happened. One of the bodies shifted slightly, just enough to suggest that perhaps not everything was as it seemed. A gasp, a shiver. Did they move? Were they alive? The intruder froze, heart hammering, unable to distinguish reality from fear, imagination from truth. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every sound amplified, every detail carrying the weight of the unimaginable. Questions surged through their mind like a torrent. How long had these bodies been here? Were they connected? Who had placed them in this garage, and why? What secrets did they hold that someone had gone to such lengths to hide? Each thought led to more confusion, more dread, more curiosity, until the intruder realized that they were standing on the threshold of a mystery far larger than themselves. A mystery that, once revealed, could not be unseen, undone, or ignored. And just when it seemed they might be able to gather themselves, to step back and consider their next move, a door at the far end of the garage creaked. Not the main entrance. A secondary, hidden door, previously unnoticed, now moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested someone, or something, was approaching. The intruder's heart lurched. Breath caught. Every instinct screamed escape, yet their body remained frozen. Because in that moment, the realization hit them, they were not alone. And whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that hidden door would soon confront them. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What do you do when your worst fear comes to life in front of you? When the stories you've heard, the warnings whispered behind closed doors, and the faint unease you felt for years converge into a horrifying reality. That night, in that garage, reality shattered. It wasn't just darkness, dust, and shadows anymore. It was bodies, lifeless, silent, haunting, each one a testament to secrets that had been buried for far too long. The intruder's eyes struggled to adjust. Shapes emerged from the gloom. First one, then another, then a cluster, each more horrifying than the last. They froze, their body trembling with a mix of adrenaline, fear, and disbelief. The faint metallic scent in the air grew stronger, mingling with the scent of dust and motor oil, creating an almost tangible weight of dread. The mind struggles in moments like these, refusing to accept, trying to rationalize, desperately grasping for an explanation that simply doesn't exist. Who were these people? What had happened to them? And why, of all places, were they here? Questions collided in the intruder's mind, unanswerable and overwhelming. But then, something even more chilling became apparent. This was no accident. No random tragedy. The bodies had been placed here deliberately, arranged in a way that was methodical, purposeful, almost ritualistic. Every inch of the garage told a story of secrecy, of control, of a darkness hidden beneath the gilded surface of royal life. Some of the bodies were positioned upright, slumped against walls, while others lay sprawled across the concrete floor. The intruder noticed faint marks on wrists, necks, ankles, subtle but undeniable signs of restraint. Items were scattered nearby, ropes, fragments of fabric, objects that suggested containment. There was no question now. These people had been trapped, silenced, left here in a state of permanent stillness. The reality of it was suffocating. Imagine standing there, heart pounding, unable to comprehend fully what your eyes are seeing, but knowing deep down that the scene before you is real. That is the weight that pressed down on the intruder. Each step closer revealed more. Faces partially obscured by shadows, eyes staring emptily into the distance. Clothing tattered, evidence of struggle. The mind cannot process this all at once. It refuses to. But the senses do not lie. Every detail confirmed the impossible. These were lifeless human beings. A flicker of movement, or perhaps a trick of the light, made the intruder jump. Could one of them still be alive? No. Impossible, they told themselves. Lifeless. Silent. And yet the uncertainty gnawed at their mind. What if there was someone, somewhere in the garage, watching? Someone who had orchestrated this entire scene? The paranoia was natural. The fear, almost tangible. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every sound, footsteps, creaking, the faint shuffle of clothing, magnified into something threatening. And then, a horrifying detail emerged. Among the bodies, there were items that didn't belong. Personal belongings, documents, perhaps even photographs. Evidence, subtle but undeniable, that linked these people not just to each other but to a network, a secret, a story that no one outside the garage had any right to know. Who were these individuals in life? And what had led them to this grim fate? The intruder felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the metallic smell. It was the weight of understanding, the realization that they were standing amidst the evidence of calculated horror. It wasn't just the arrangement or the objects. It was the scale. There were more bodies than anyone could have expected. Some had been here for days, others for weeks, perhaps even months. Time left its marks. The faint discoloration of skin, the subtle decay, the way dust settled over them like a shroud. And yet, some details suggested something more recent, more deliberate, more carefully executed. This was not random. This was orchestrated, controlled, and hidden with intent. The intruder's mind raced. Could the public ever comprehend this? Would the royal family acknowledge it? Or would it be dismissed, buried beneath layers of denial, secrecy, and spin? And yet, here they were, in the moment, forced to witness the truth that had been kept from the world. They could not look away. The human instinct to turn and flee ward with the insatiable curiosity to understand, to catalog, to grasp the unimaginable. Every object, every shadow, every detail seemed to whisper a story. A shoe left slightly askew, a stain on the floor, the faint scent of chemicals. These were not just bodies. They were narratives, histories, lives interrupted in a place that promised nothing but secrecy and concealment. The intruder realized that what they were witnessing was a puzzle, but one whose pieces were ghastly, horrifying, and impossible to ignore. And then there was the contradiction. On the one hand, the garage was ordinary, a simple space meant for storage, the mundane and banal. On the other, it was extraordinary, a chamber of horror, a testament to secrecy, control, and the darkest capacities of power. How could these two realities exist in the same space? How could a place that seemed so innocuous from the outside hold such unimaginable terror inside? The duality was disorienting, almost surreal, forcing the mind to struggle to reconcile normalcy with atrocity. The intruder's thoughts turned to the prince. How could someone in a position of privilege, visibility, and public scrutiny allow such a place to exist? The contradiction was staggering. Every public appearance, every charity event, every smiling photo in the papers painted an image of affability, nobility, and even charm. And yet, behind the garage door, reality told a story of horror, secrecy, and possibly complicity. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, and yet unavoidable. And still, the intruder moved forward, drawn by the need to see, to understand, to confront the unimaginable. They noticed the smallest details: a scrap of paper with indecipherable writing, a faint indentation on the concrete where someone had been moved, a stain that suggested struggle. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle they didn't yet understand, each clue a whisper of a story waiting to be told. But just as they were beginning to process the scale of what they were seeing, a sound shattered the fragile quiet. A thump, deliberate, unmistakable, coming from the far end of the garage. The intruder froze, heart pounding, breath caught. Every instinct screamed that someone else was here, that they were not alone. And the horror of that realization was immediate and suffocating. What would happen if whoever, or whatever, was making that sound discovered them? Could they escape? Could they survive witnessing this scene? The answers were unknown. Every step they had taken, every moment they had lingered, had led them to this critical juncture. The bodies themselves seemed to pulse with the tension in the room, silent witnesses to an encounter that was about to escalate beyond imagination. And then, the faint light from the hidden door flickered again. Someone, or something, was moving closer. The intruder realized that the garage was not just a place of discovery, but of imminent danger. What they had stumbled upon was not simply evidence of horror, it was a stage, and they were now part of the performance, caught in a web of secrecy and power far beyond their comprehension. The bodies lay still, silent, lifeless, yet their presence demanded attention, demanded confrontation, demanded recognition of the unimaginable truth. And the intruder, paralyzed by fear and driven by curiosity, understood that there was no turning back. They were witnessing a scene that could never be erased, a truth that could never be hidden again. But what came next would push the boundary of disbelief even further, and no one, not even the intruder, could have predicted the revelation that was about to unfold. Have you ever wondered how a place so ordinary on the outside, a rusted garage tucked behind manicured hedges, could be tied to power so extraordinary that the world itself might never fully understand it? That's exactly what made this discovery so chilling. It wasn't just the lifeless bodies, the evidence of struggle, the whispered horrors. No, it was the realization that this garage was not separate from the royal world. It was a part of it, a hidden corner of a kingdom, a secret stage where privilege and secrecy collided in ways no one dared imagine. The intruder, still frozen in place, began to piece it together. Subtle details that had seemed inconsequential before, the security measures, the arrangement of objects, the faint symbols etched into surfaces, now carried new weight. Every element suggested a connection, a deliberate link to Prince Andrew himself. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. This was a shadow of influence, a footprint of power that extended far beyond the garage walls. Step back for a moment and think about the paradox. Prince Andrew, a man constantly in the public eye, attending galas, charity events, official duties, and photo ops, and yet behind this garage door, reality told a completely different story. A story of secrecy, control, and a chilling ability to hide the unthinkable. Publicly, he was the smiling prince, the figure of authority, the embodiment of privilege. Privately, He had a space where rules did not apply, where consequences were muted by status, and where dark, disturbing acts could be carried out unseen. And that duality, it's almost impossible to reconcile. How can someone so visible, so scrutinized, maintain a hidden life that defies the logic of transparency? How could countless eyes, cameras, and staff not notice? Yet, that's precisely what happened. People who worked in the household, those who delivered supplies, those who maintained the estate, they all knew something was off. They didn't need to see the bodies themselves to sense the weight of secrecy that hung over the garage. They felt it in the air, in the discipline of the guards, in the unnatural quiet that surrounded the building. The intruder's mind raced. Every object in the garage was a clue, a thread connecting back to the prince. Documents, small personal items, tools arranged with care, all whispered the same thing. Power and secrecy were intertwined here. This was not just about hiding evidence. This was about controlling narrative, controlling perception, and asserting authority in a space where the law of the outside world could not reach. It was a stark, uncomfortable reminder that privilege, when combined with intent and secrecy, could allow horrors to persist unnoticed for years. And then came the stark contradiction. The same man whose public image projected responsibility, decency, and service had a private space that suggested something far darker. The intruder realized that the garage was not an anomaly. It was a symbol, a representation of the lengths some would go to protect secrets that could topple reputations, shatter careers, and shake the foundation of monarchy itself. Have you ever noticed how the public rarely sees the private mechanisms of power? How the grand halls and televised appearances are only the surface? Inside those halls, inside private estates, there are entire worlds we cannot access, rituals, routines, and in some cases, horrors that exist only because no one outside can intervene. This garage was one such world. It was a hidden ecosystem, shielded by wealth, influence, and meticulous planning. And now, the intruder was standing in the center of it, forced to confront the truth directly. And it wasn't just physical evidence. There were behavioral clues too. Security protocols that didn't make sense for ordinary protection, staff reactions tinged with subtle fear, patterns of deliveries and disappearances that were clearly designed to obscure reality. The intruder realized that these details weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated, woven into the daily operations of the estate to maintain a facade, while the unimaginable persisted behind closed doors. It was in this realization that the horror deepened. This wasn't just about the bodies. This was about a system, a network, a hidden connection between privilege and impunity. The bodies were the tip of the iceberg. Behind them lay questions of complicity, of oversight, and of silence. How many had suspected but remained quiet? How many had rationalized their unease because challenging a prince could cost them everything? Reputation, livelihood, even personal safety. The intruder felt the weight of these questions pressing down, making the air feel even heavier. And then, a new detail emerged, subtle but undeniable. A photograph, partially obscured by shadow, depicted someone familiar, the prince himself. Not in a public setting, not smiling for the cameras, but in a context that suggested direct involvement, or at the very least, knowledge. The intruder froze. Heart pounded. The room seemed to contract. They understood, suddenly, that the bodies weren't just an isolated horror. They were a reflection, a consequence of the prince's private world. The connection became undeniable when a set of documents fell from a nearby shelf. Papers, carefully stacked, handwritten notes, records of movements, appointments, deliveries, all linking the people in the garage to royal operations. The intruder flipped through them, each page confirming what they had begun to suspect. There was a deliberate, methodical link between the prince's private affairs and the presence of these lifeless bodies. It wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. And orchestration demanded accountability, attention, and fear. What does it say about power when someone can maintain a facade while hiding such a dark reality? How can the public reconcile the image of nobility with acts that are morally, ethically, and legally disturbing? These are questions that linger, not just in the mind of the intruder, but for anyone who dares to confront the truth. And in this moment, the intruder became the first person in decades to fully connect the dots, to understand the garage not as an isolated horror, but as a window into a hidden, powerful network. And yet, the tension escalated further. The hidden door at the far end of the garage creaked again. Shadows shifted. There was a sense that someone was approaching, that the intruder was no longer alone, and that the reality they were witnessing was about to collide with someone who might not welcome this intrusion. Every instinct screamed danger. Every rational thought screamed retreat. But stepping back would mean abandoning the most significant, horrifying truth of their life. And in that moment, the intruder understood something even more terrifying. The garage wasn't just a location. It was a portal, a gateway into the private world of royalty, where power, secrecy, and horror intersected in ways that no outsider was meant to comprehend. And now, standing in the midst of evidence, facing the weight of a reality few could imagine, the intruder realized that the night was far from over. The garage had more to reveal, but what came next would expose connections that went far beyond the garage itself, and no one could predict the fallout. Have you ever stumbled across something so secret, so meticulously concealed, that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about the people involved? That night, the intruder realized the garage was more than a site of horror. It was a repository of secrets, hidden in plain sight, yet deliberately obscured. The evidence scattered throughout the room promised answers, but only if someone dared to uncover it. And daring came with a price. The first pieces were almost unnoticeable. A small envelope tucked behind a toolbox, stained and creased as if it had been handled countless times. Inside, documents, handwritten notes, lists of names, dates, cryptic shorthand that hinted at meetings, movements, and arrangements no ordinary person would understand. These were not the scattered scraps of a disorganized mind. They were deliberate, purposeful, carefully maintained records, meticulously cataloged to ensure that the hidden world of the garage could survive scrutiny, at least for a time. The intruder could feel the weight of the information pressing down, heavy with implications. Every line, every annotation, hinted at connections and actions that went far beyond the obvious horror. The garage was a stage, yes, but it was also a control room, a place where power was exercised silently, methodically, and with terrifying efficiency. And each piece of evidence pointed toward a truth that, if revealed, would shatter not only reputations but the very perception of the royal household. Among the scattered evidence were objects whose ordinary appearances belied their significance. A ledger with columns of names and dates. Receipts that traced the delivery of untraceable materials. Small, seemingly innocuous tools whose presence suggested that the bodies had been manipulated, arranged, or maintained in ways designed to hide the truth from anyone who might stumble upon the scene. Every detail screamed intention. Nothing here was accidental. And then came the documents that were even more disturbing. Photographs, partially obscured, showing individuals who were later identified as members of the household, connected indirectly to Prince Andrew. These images, innocuous to the untrained eye, revealed patterns of movement, unusual visits, and moments where the boundary between ordinary life and the hidden world of the garage blurred. There was no chaos here. There was orchestration. Every item, every document, every trace of activity in this room told the story of planning and secrecy, a network of influence stretching far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Have you ever noticed how the smallest details can carry the heaviest weight? A pen left on a shelf, a mark on the floor, a smudge on a page. They can hint at actions, motives, even crimes. In this garage, every small object was loaded with meaning. The intruder's gaze swept over the space again, each detail revealing a layer of the truth. They realized that what they were seeing was not a random act of cruelty, but a meticulously controlled environment where life, and ultimately death, had been manipulated. And then there was the unmistakable presence of coded messages. Symbols, abbreviations, and notations that hinted at hidden agreements, undisclosed meetings, and perhaps even complicity. The intruder could not decipher all of it. Some of it required knowledge or access they did not have, but the implication was clear. These documents were not mere remnants of a personal life. They were instruments of control, kept hidden in a space where few dared to look, where the risk of discovery was calculated against the potential consequences. The magnitude of the hidden evidence began to overwhelm the intruder. Every shred of paper, Every carefully positioned object, every hint of a previous presence painted a picture far more intricate and disturbing than the bodies alone. The garage had been a hub of activity, secrecy, and possibly conspiracy, and the realization settled heavily. Someone, or multiple people, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the truth remained hidden, that the world outside remained ignorant. But what made the evidence truly shocking was the contradiction it revealed. On one hand, the garage was a simple, ordinary space. Rusted metal, concrete floors, the faint smell of oil and dust. On the other hand, it contained evidence of systematic planning, deliberate concealment, and activities that extended into the highest echelons of privilege. It was a paradox of visibility and invisibility, where public perception clashed violently with private reality. The intruder, heart pounding, moved carefully, examining a small stack of files on a low shelf. One folder contained correspondence between unnamed figures, references to logistics, instructions, and outcomes. Some of the names were obscured or coded, but others were unmistakable: staff members, associates, people whose daily work revolved around the prints. The connections were subtle, indirect, yet undeniable. The more the intruder looked, the more they realized that this evidence was not merely about the garage or the bodies. It was about a network, a shadow world functioning within, or alongside, the royal estate. And then, something entirely unexpected came to light. A small box, previously unnoticed, fell to the floor as the intruder brushed against the shelf. Inside were objects that suggested careful concealment: sealed envelopes, photographs with faces deliberately obscured, and even small items of clothing that didn't belong to the bodies in the garage. Each item carried an air of deliberate secrecy, hinting at actions and events that had been hidden from the public eye. The intruder realized that the garage held evidence not only of what had occurred here, but also of actions extending beyond the room itself. Events that tied into a web of influence, control, and secrecy reaching far outside the walls of the estate. Questions surged like a flood. How long had this evidence been accumulating? Who was responsible for maintaining it? And why, despite its clear implications, had it been allowed to persist undisturbed? The intruder understood that the garage was not merely a physical space. It was a mechanism for controlling perception, for ensuring that only a privileged few could access the truth. And now, for the first time, an outsider had breached that mechanism. And yet, even with all this evidence, the intruder knew that the most damning revelations were still hidden. The garage had layers: physical, metaphorical, and procedural. What they had found so far was just the surface. The objects, the documents, the faint signs of orchestration. They hinted at deeper truths that were still obscured, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough, or reckless enough, to continue. But the most chilling detail of all emerged from the shadows. One of the documents referenced something even more horrifying than the bodies themselves. Something that suggested the events in the garage were part of a larger pattern, a calculated series of actions, perhaps even a system of concealment that had persisted for years. The intruder froze, realizing that what they had stumbled upon was not just a crime scene or a hidden horror. It was a window into a carefully maintained secret world, one whose full extent might never be revealed. And as the hidden door at the far end of the garage creaked again, signaling the approach of someone, or something, the intruder understood the gravity of the situation. They were standing amidst evidence that connected power, secrecy, and horror in ways the world was never meant to see. The garage had revealed its first layer, but deeper truths waited in the shadows, ready to shatter everything once more. But what came next would uncover connections so explosive, so deeply tied to the royal inner circle, that no one could predict the consequences. When the news finally reached the palace, it didn't arrive quietly. It crashed through the corridors like a storm, shattering the carefully maintained calm that the royal household had cultivated for decades. The discovery in the garage, the bodies, the hidden evidence, the meticulous documentation, was no longer a whispered rumor or a legend confined to staff quarters. It was real, and it demanded action. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Palace officials, usually measured and composed, scrambled to make sense of the unfolding crisis. Phones rang constantly, guards were redeployed, and a flurry of hushed meetings took place behind closed doors. There was tension in the air so thick it could almost be felt. A combination of fear, disbelief, and the urgent need to control a narrative that had suddenly threatened to spiral out of control. Imagine the conversations happening in those secret rooms. "Are we sure it's true?" one aide might ask, voice low, almost trembling. Another would reply, "There's no denying it. The evidence is too clear. Someone has to handle this before it gets out." Every word was measured, every gesture calculated. The palace understood one fundamental truth. In this world, perception is everything. And now, perception was on the verge of collapse. The security protocols around the estate were intensified immediately. Access points were sealed, cameras adjusted, and the staff warned in no uncertain terms that they must maintain absolute secrecy. Whispers circulated among the lower-level personnel, and some could feel the tension rolling off the senior aides like heat from a furnace. There was fear, yes, but there was also a profound sense of disbelief. How could something so horrifying exist under their noses without being noticed for so long? And then there was Prince Andrew himself, the man at the center of the storm, publicly a figure of authority and decorum, privately tied to a garage that had concealed unspeakable horrors. According to sources within the palace, the reaction was a mix of shock, panic, and self-preservation. Every word he spoke, every action he took, was scrutinized, calculated to maintain control over a situation that, for the first time, had slipped entirely beyond his reach. It's worth considering the psychology of this moment. Imagine discovering that a part of your private life, the place you thought of as secure, a space immune from scrutiny, has been exposed. The bodies, the evidence, the meticulous records, all a testament to events that others may link directly to you. The human response in such situations is often a combination of denial, deflection, and frantic damage control. And the palace's response reflected that perfectly. Meetings were held in secret, advisors were summoned, and contingency plans were drawn up to manage both internal and external reactions. Yet there was another layer to this reaction, one that outsiders rarely see. Beyond panic and damage control, there was strategy. Every communication, every action, every statement or lack thereof was part of a delicate dance. The palace had to manage multiple audiences simultaneously. The public, who would demand answers, the media, who would speculate endlessly, staff, whose loyalty and discretion were paramount, and of course, the family itself, whose reputation and future were at stake. And the irony was almost cruel. The very secrecy that had allowed the garage to exist undisturbed for so long now became both a shield and a weapon. On the one hand, it provided the palace with leverage. They could deny knowledge, dismiss rumors, and rely on the plausibility of ignorance. On the other, it was a ticking time bomb. The longer they tried to contain it, the more evidence piled up, waiting to be revealed. Every delay, every misstep, risked compounding the scandal exponentially. Inside the palace, the corridors buzzed with tension. Advisors whispered in corners, strategizing how to frame the narrative, how to explain the existence of a garage whose contents defied comprehension. Security personnel were briefed on restricting access, while communications teams prepared statements, vague enough to avoid legal liability, precise enough to suggest oversight. And all the while, the intruder's discovery had set into motion a chain of events that no one could stop. The juxtaposition was striking. Outside, the estate appeared unchanged, flowers in bloom, gravel paths undisturbed, guards stationed as always. Inside, chaos reigned. The palace had to reconcile the normalcy of public appearances with the horror of private realities. Every royal engagement, every smile for the cameras, every handshake became part of a high-stakes performance designed to maintain credibility while the garage's secrets threatened to unravel the narrative entirely. And there were whispers of conflict within the palace itself. Different factions argued over the best course of action. Some insisted on complete containment, fearing the scandal's reach. Others advocated for swift disclosure, reasoning that acknowledging the horror openly might mitigate long-term reputational damage. The tension between these approaches created friction even among those accustomed to hierarchical obedience. Tempers flared, and for the first time, The intruder's discovery had fractured the internal cohesion of one of the most controlled, image-conscious institutions in the world. Every action was deliberate, yet fraught with risk. Decisions had to balance legality, morality, and optics. Advisors debated how to explain the bodies, how to respond to potential leaks, how to maintain loyalty among staff while preventing further intrusion. And through it all, the central question loomed. What would happen if the truth could not be contained? The intruder's discovery had thrown a spotlight on the very limits of power, exposing vulnerabilities that no palace had ever faced so directly. And then came the moment of confrontation. Officials went to the garage, not to investigate in the normal sense, but to assess the situation, to catalog what had been discovered, and to plan a narrative that could contain the fallout. They moved with precision, urgency, and fear, aware that every misstep could have catastrophic consequences. The bodies, the hidden evidence, the arrangements, all became a matter of strategy rather than morality, a testament to the lengths the palace would go to maintain control. But the most unsettling part was not the reaction itself. It was the realization that this reaction, every meeting, every strategy session, every whispered conversation, was dictated not by justice or morality, but by the need to protect the public image. Lives had been lost, evidence had been found, and yet, the overriding priority remained perception. The palace had to maintain authority, credibility, and the illusion of stability, even in the face of horror that defied comprehension. And through all this, the intruder understood the scale of what had been uncovered. They realized that the garage was not merely a location of secret horror. It was a mirror reflecting the mechanisms of power, secrecy, and control within one of the most scrutinized families in the world. It was a space where public and private realities collided in the most disturbing ways imaginable. And just when it seemed the palace had assessed every angle, every precaution, every plan, something entirely unexpected occurred. A visitor, unauthorized, yet familiar, appeared at the estate, someone with knowledge of both the bodies and the hidden evidence. Their arrival threatened to expose what the palace had tried to contain, introducing an element of unpredictability that no strategy could account for. But what came next would reveal connections and consequences that went far beyond the palace walls, and no one could foresee the full scale of the fallout. When the story finally reached the outside world, the reaction was instantaneous, explosive, and unrelenting. It didn't travel quietly through newspapers or filtered statements. No, it erupted, spreading through social media, tabloids, 24-hour news cycles, and instant messaging chains like wildfire. The discovery in Prince Andrew's garage, the lifeless bodies, the hidden evidence, the meticulous arrangement, was no longer a secret confined to whispered corridors. It was now public knowledge, and the world could not look away. The first reports were cautious, almost understated. Headlines hinted at mystery, at secrecy, at intrigue. Royal estate in shock. Alleged discovery stuns staff. Mystery surrounds private garage. But within hours, the information escalated. Photos of the exterior estate, taken by curious onlookers, spread across social media. Every camera angle, every detail of the property, was scrutinized and circulated. Speculation grew. Theories multiplied. And the public became a voracious audience, hungry for the full story. Imagine the sensation of seeing your private horror suddenly dissected in front of millions. The palace, already scrambling internally, now faced an external storm it had not fully anticipated. Analysts debated the implications. Reporters dug for details. Bloggers and commentators dissected every past event, every public appearance, every official statement, trying to draw lines between the prince's public image and the private reality exposed by the garage. Nothing was off limits, nothing too sensitive to be speculated about. And the scale of the reaction was staggering. International media picked up the story within hours. News outlets in the United States, Australia, and across Europe ran pieces linking the discovery to broader questions of privilege, secrecy, and accountability. Journalists with connections to palace insiders teased details of the hidden evidence, the arrangements of the bodies, and the possible complicity of staff members. Public outrage began to swell, fueled by a mixture of horror, disbelief, and fascination. What makes stories like this so compelling is the human instinct for voyeurism, the deep-seated curiosity about lives that exist beyond ordinary understanding. People wanted to know what had been hidden, how it had been hidden, and what the implications were. Every new detail released, every leaked document, every snippet of evidence analyzed on air drew more attention. And each revelation seemed to demand a reaction: shock, anger, incredulity, or all three. The palace, predictably, tried to manage the narrative, issuing statements that were carefully worded to acknowledge nothing while suggesting control. But in the digital age, controlling perception is an impossible task. Leaks, whether intentional or accidental, undermined the careful construction of public messaging. Analysts dissected